The Dickson House is a place that you will never forget. It's important because it's a place, once you've come here, you've had an experience, it's a unique experience, and it's a place that is inspiring and really just, it takes you back in time. The restoration of the Dickson House was an enormous undertaking, and I think that it's the significance of that restoration is something that is of tremendous value. It was of tremendous value to the community, and it still is. And this house is it's valuable in terms of both local significance and then American history.
In 1983, the Preservation Fund of Hillsborough acquired the Alexander Dickson House from across I-85, where it was threatened with extinction, and had it disassembled and moved to this site and repositioned on a stone foundation. At that point, I believe the foundation figured out it was a more extensive project than they had anticipated, contacted me and asked me to undertake its restoration. The house on its original site was greatly deteriorated. It had most of its parts intact, but I believe it was pretty uninhabitable at the time it was finally rescued and moved to this site. During the move, the movers removed siding around the lower edges of the house and found its timber sills to be in bad condition, which meant that in order for them to lift it, they had to replace some of those timber sills. And at the point where those timber sills came out, a lot of the brick nogging that was on the interior of the walls jangled out and obviously fell down and was lost to the site. So when I found it, the house was sitting here on the new site, but the lower half of it was covered in plywood, and basically everything was in a deteriorated condition. Got to start with the framing on any house restoration. Everything hangs from the frame. If the frame isn't level and true and strong enough to secure the siding, the interior, the trim to it, and provide a flat plane to do that, you can't really come ahead on the restoration of an antique house. So framing first. And these pictures show how we dismantled the rest of the siding that was hiding the damage, located damaged framing members, and then cut them out. Basically, we did simple, old-fashioned repairs by cutting a bad piece of timber out, making a nice new scarf joint, applying a two-part epoxy to that joint to glue the new piece to the old piece, using modern wood or whatever we had to extend the pieces. And I would guess some 70% of the frame of this house, due to the ill effects of having that brick nogging in there and the animals that had lived in there, were destroyed on one end or the other. The roof we found just plopped on top of the two-story structure. It had spread. A roof is a large triangle. A triangle has to be attached at all three corners, and in this case it was not attached at the corners, and so the roof had splay off the top plates and top floor joists. We ran a cable back and forth all the way along all the rafter ends, pulled that cable with turnbuckles, and at the same time we erected jacks down the ridge line and lifted the ridge line back up to its proper height. And between the two, brought the tips of the rafters back to their original location and then secured them to the original framing that wasn't damaged up on top. And we had a roof. Restoring the chimney was the most hazardous, difficult part of the project. It was sitting at an angle. It had some giant cracks in it. The chimney stack above the shoulders, where the chimney tapers at the top, had been removed for the move because it was too tall to fit under bridges and cables. And the base had been set relatively casually on top of masonry that had been poured, that had been built on top of the new footings. The fireboxes appeared to be of square top, cast iron or a wrought iron piece of steel supporting a flat top on the fireplace openings, but indeed when we took the woodwork off and the mantles off, we found that they had arch tops, which dates the house into the late 18th century rather than into the early 19th century where those arches were no longer used. So my big fear being to not lose the chimney as we restored it meant that I wrapped it very carefully with timber. We ran timbers up the side, up the faces. We put bracing timbers in so they couldn't slump to one side or the other. I probably way overkilled the amount of bracing and shoring I did to the chimney before we began to lift it because I didn't want to lose it. And I didn't want the fact that we had to dig underneath the brickwork of the chimney and put jacks in to allow the chimney to become unstable enough to slump and fail and begin to fall apart. It's not made with very sticky mortar. It's made with old-fashioned lime mortar, and the interior brickwork is actually laid up with clay instead of mortar. So it does not have a lot of structural integrity if you start wrestling it as we were. Turning our attention to the interior house, we found that we had most of the trim intact. Very typical late 18th century, early 19th century trim in an upper middle class home. The wall surfaces are a combination of plain plank wainscot under a chair rail, and then a plastered wall above, and the plaster had been laid on top of that brick nogging I've mentioned that was in the interior of the walls. So we didn't find that we had to replace trim. We didn't gussy the interior up. We didn't redecorate the interior. We repaired what we found. Floorboards, another matter. We had to replace a lot of the flooring because the lower structure of the house was so damaged that it took the floorboards with it. Although the floorboards are nice, longleaf yellow pine or just a nice yellow pine on the first floor. But on the second floor, the floorboards are the original wide planks that the house had, and they survived all of this time very nicely. We merely rubbed them out and refinished them. We painted our window sash inside and out of white color, and then we found evidence of the exterior green, this Kelly green, if you will. It showed up on our backs of our trim boards. It showed up underneath places that had been hidden for many years. It showed up as sloppiness from the original painters. As we wrapped up the work on the main house here, we needed porches. We found ghosts of original exterior front porch, so we reproduced those porches in the style that we find was popular throughout Hillsborough. We also then turned our attention to the office in the backyard. We removed damaged siding on that building, restored its stone piers, built new stone piers underneath it, and built a new reproduction chimney with reproduction bricks on one end of the house. And we were fortunate to find ghosts in the paint of the original siding of the house to show us exactly what the size and shape was of that brick chimney. In order to ensure the longevity of this house, every repair we made was with a thought to long life, to keep it in good condition and to preclude having to do any more expensive, any more restoration work. At this point, it's ongoing maintenance, and if we can keep that maintenance up to snuff, we can preserve this house for future generations to come to enjoy. And I think that's very important.